You don't belong here. Get up before I call security." The words exploded from Charlotte's mouth like a slap, loud, sharp, and public slicing through the quiet hum of the aircraft cabin as every head in first class turned. A few gasped. Others just froze mid-motion, their morning coffees trembling slightly in plastic cups. But all eyes locked onto one person, William. A 16-year-old black teenager in jeans, clean sneakers, and a navy hoodie sitting calmly in seat 3A, glancing up from a worn leather folder filled with notes for the National Youth Leadership Summit he was flying to attend in Chicago. He wasn't fidgeting. He wasn't causing any trouble. He was just sitting there quietly, exactly where his boarding pass had told him to. But for Charlotte, one of the flight attendants working Flight 417 from New York to Chicago, his presence didn't sit right. Something in her tightened the moment she saw him. Maybe it was the hoodie. Maybe it was the way he didn't seem nervous or apologetic. Or maybe deep down, it was something she wasn't ready to admit. Before we dive deeper into this story, where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments. And if stories like this one, raw, real, and powerful, mean something to you, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Now back to the moment that shocked everyone on that flight. Charlotte didn't wait for a response. "I said move to the back," she snapped again, louder this time. "First class isn't for kids like you." The cabin went still. William's fingers curled slightly under his folder, but his voice was steady. "Ma'am, this is my assigned seat." He pulled out his boarding pass and extended it without emotion. His name was printed clearly, William James Reynolds. Seat 3A, first class, confirmed. But Charlotte didn't even look at it. Her mind was already made up. Her words weren't just about a seat. They came from something deeper. A lifetime of resentment, pain, and buried bias. Charlotte had grown up in the Midwest in a family where struggle was passed down like china plates, delicate, heavy, and never quite handled right. Her mother had left when she was 11. Her older brother overdosed when she was 17. And in her mind, the world owed her a kind of fairness she never received. People like William Young, smart, unbothered, represented everything she thought had been stolen from her. "I don't care what that paper says," she barked. "You either move now, or you'll be escorted off this plane before we take off." A white couple in the row across Benjamin and Emma Langford, well-dressed, well-off, and well into their 60s, whispered with visible discomfort. He must have snuck up here. Emma clutched her purse a little tighter. 3 months ago, they'd been pickpocketed in Central Park by a young black teen. That single incident had since clouded every similar face they saw. To them, William was a reminder, not of someone else's crime, but of their own prejudice left unchecked. William took a deep breath. He wasn't new to this kind of tension. He'd grown up in Brooklyn, raised by a father who taught him to lead with calm, not heat. And that calm is what he carried now, despite the growing murmurs around him. "Ma'am, please scan the ticket," he said again. "I worked hard for this seat." That one line struck Charlotte harder than she expected. Worked hard. To her, those were fighting words. They implied she hadn't, that others like her hadn't, that he somehow deserved this spot. She turned without another word and stormed to the galley. William stared ahead, breathing slowly. In his pocket, his phone vibrated. He opened it, typed 4 words, and hit send. Trouble in first class. That text went straight to his father, James Reynolds, waiting at the gate in Chicago, CEO of the airline. A fact William didn't throw around. He wasn't trying to flex power. He wasn't trying to humiliate anyone. He just wanted to sit in peace and fly to a conference he had spent the last 6 months preparing for. That seat had been a gift from his father, but the opportunity had been earned. Every late night of study, every community center volunteer hour, every recommendation letter, it had led to that very moment. And now it was unraveling in front of dozens of strangers, not because of anything he did, but because someone refused to see him as worthy of being where he was. Behind the curtain, Charlotte barked something into the intercom, and moments later, a uniformed security officer appeared near the cockpit. "Passenger in 3A is refusing to move," she said, voice lowered but still audible. Might be using a fake ticket. Olivia, another flight attendant, older, fair-skinned, with a gentle presence and a hint of silver in her hair, stepped forward from the opposite aisle. She'd been watching from the start. Charlotte. I scanned his ticket. It's valid. He's in the right seat. But Charlotte wasn't backing down. Then we'll see what the officer says, she replied flatly, brushing past her colleague. The officer approached William asking for ID and confirmation. William provided it all: boarding pass, student ID, confirmation email. Everything matched. But the damage was already spreading. Whisper's glances raised eyebrows. He felt like a spotlight had been pinned to his chest. William sat motionless, refusing to let himself sink, refusing to show fear. The officer hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. He's not causing trouble, the officer murmured to Charlotte. Everything checks out. But Charlotte, her ego bruised and her judgment clouded, doubled down. Then why don't you ask him why a kid dressed like that is in first class? That's when a voice, steady, gravelly, and fed up, rose from row 2C. Because this kid earned it, unlike some of us who just show up bitter and empty. The cabin turned toward the man standing, a retired school teacher named Lucas, eyes locked on Charlotte. William didn't know it yet, but he had just gained his first ally. The battle for dignity had only just begun. The air inside the cabin felt tighter now, like everyone was holding their breath, unsure of which direction this confrontation would turn next. Charlotte returned from the galley with a kind of grim satisfaction in her stride, a uniformed airport security officer following close behind. "That's him," she said without hesitation, pointing directly at William, who remained seated, calm but alert. The officer, a middle-aged man with a weary face and clipboard in hand, approached slowly. "Son, I need to see your ID and boarding pass." William obliged without complaint, handing over his student ID printed ticket and even pulling up the digital version on his phone. The officer looked through each document carefully, furrowing his brow. Everything checked out, every name matched, every seat confirmed. But Charlotte didn't back down. "Check again," she insisted, her voice growing sharper. "He's causing a disruption, refusing to move, and I think he's using someone else's booking. There's no way he's supposed to be here." William glanced up at the man, then over at Charlotte. His hands were folded neatly in his lap, but his heart was pounding hard against his chest. He wasn't scared, just tired. Tired of moments like this, tired of the quiet battle for basic respect, tired of being made to prove his presence every time someone else felt uncomfortable. "Ma'am," the officer finally said, turning toward Charlotte, "the documents are valid. Everything's in order." But she didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned in closer, lowering her voice just enough to mask her venom. "You really think a teenager like him is flying first class on a Monday morning with a ticket in his name?" The officer hesitated, clearly caught between protocol and her conviction. "Look at how he's dressed," she added. "We've had issues with fraudulent tickets before." A few rows back, Benjamin and Emma shifted again, Emma whispering just loud enough for the row ahead to hear, "He's clearly lying. Kids like that game the system all the time." Benjamin nodded. "Reminds me of that boy who grabbed my wallet in Central Park." Same attitude, same look. Their words weren't shouted, but they didn't have to be. Prejudice has a way of slipping through cracks, quiet, poisonous, and persistent. Olivia, the second flight attendant, who had watched all of this unfold, finally stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. "I checked the manifest myself. His name is on the list, assigned seat 3A. You can check the tablet if you don't believe me." She handed over the flight crew device, and after a few seconds of scrolling, the officer's eyes landed on the line, "Reynolds Williams seat 3A. He turned it toward Charlotte, but she barely looked. "Fine," she muttered, "but I still don't feel comfortable with him up here." That was when William quietly spoke up. "I'm not here to make anyone comfortable. I'm here because I earned it, and I have every right to stay." His voice didn't shake. He didn't raise it. But there was steel in it, unbending, undeniable. Charlotte stared at him, and something in her expression cracked just slightly. It wasn't fear or guilt. It was something closer to insult, as if he'd just reminded her of how little control she really had. "Don't get smart," she snapped. "Don't play the victim." Olivia stepped forward again, this time standing between Charlotte and William. "You're crossing a line," she said. "He's not doing anything wrong. And frankly, I'm not going to let you escalate this further." At that moment, something shifted in the cabin. A murmur began from the aisle behind them, then a clear voice cut through. "Let the boy be," said Lucas, the retired teacher from row 2C. He stood slowly, hands steady. "He's not a threat. He's a passenger. And frankly, I'm ashamed it's taken this long for someone to say it." Charlotte turned toward him, blinking like she'd been slapped. "Sir, please take your seat," she said. But Lucas didn't budge. "No, I won't. I spent 40 years teaching young people from every background. You want to know what a real threat looks like. It's not a student who shows up prepared with a folder full of notes for a leadership summit. It's the kind of mindset that assumes someone doesn't belong before even asking their name." Olivia looked at him, grateful. Then another voice joined Henry, a black businessman in his 50s, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, seated quietly in 1A. "She's right," he said, gesturing to Olivia. "You're out of line. And this isn't the first time I've seen this kind of behavior on flights like these. People act polite until they think no one's watching. But we're watching now." Charlotte's jaw tightened. Her voice was quieter now, but no less cold. "This is an airline. There are rules, and fairness should be one of them," Henry replied. William, for the first time, allowed himself to take a deep breath. Not because the conflict was over, but because he wasn't alone anymore. The officer, still holding the tablet, stepped back. "There's no violation here. I suggest we move forward." Charlotte gave one last withering look, but she knew she'd lost control of the situation. "Fine," she said again, "but I'll be reporting this." Then she turned away, disappearing behind the curtain. William sat still, letting the moment settle. Then, almost without emotion, he unlocked his phone and typed a second message. Still ongoing. Now with security. Need help. He pressed send. His father would know what to do. The section ended not with shouting or tears or final words, but with something far quieter. A pause. A shift in power. A young man sitting in his rightful seat, defended not by force, but by truth. And the question now wasn't whether William would stay in first class. It was what would happen next when the world found out who he really was. As the aircraft leveled out at cruising altitude, the cabin lights dimmed slightly and the seatbelt sign dinged off with its usual chime. But there was nothing routine about the energy hovering in first class. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was tight, restless, charged with what had just occurred and what still lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. William sat in 3A, his back straight, eyes forward, and phone resting in his hand after sending his second quiet cry for help. He wasn't afraid, he was simply waiting, and in that waiting he held his ground. Charlotte, the flight attendant who had humiliated him in front of strangers, hovered by the galley pretending to adjust inventory. But her eyes darted back toward him every few seconds, lips pressed tight in frustration. The uniformed officer had returned to his seat, clearly realizing he had been pulled into something personal, something uncomfortable, and now wanted no part of it. Olivia remained in the aisle for a moment longer, checking passenger needs as if trying to re-establish a sense of normalcy, though the truth was, nothing about the moment felt normal at all. Then came the shift no one expected, not from corporate, not from crew, not even from William. It began with Charlotte making one last attempt to reclaim her footing, speaking into the intercom with a faux calm tone that couldn't quite mask the bite behind her words. "Ladies and gentlemen, please be aware we are conducting a secondary verification due to a flagged boarding discrepancy." She didn't say William's name. She didn't have to. Eyes turned. Whispers returned. The lie she had decided to stand on now echoed through the cabin in official language. But just as the murmurs began to pick up again, a new voice spoke up, deep, calm, weathered. Lucas, the retired teacher, stood again. "This is a lie," he said plainly. There was no discrepancy, only discomfort. And if anyone should be flagged, it's not the young man who's done everything right. A few rows up, Henry folded his arms and nodded. "We're watching," he said out loud. "We're not letting this slide." Olivia looked at Charlotte, her expression heavy with disappointment. "Why are you doing this?" she asked under her breath. "You already know he's cleared." Charlotte didn't answer. She turned back toward the galley and pulled the curtain shut. But the curtain didn't close the truth out, it only boxed her in. William's phone buzzed quietly. He opened the message. It was from his father, James Reynolds. 4 words. "I'm handling it now." That text, simple and controlled, wasn't just a reassurance, it was a turning point. What Charlotte didn't know, what none of the passengers knew yet, was that William's father wasn't just some worried parent texting from a terminal in Chicago. James Reynolds was the CEO of the very airline they were flying, and he wasn't watching from the sidelines anymore. Behind the scenes, James had received both of William's texts, called the corporate flight operations desk, and confirmed the crew roster. He then requested a direct feed into the cabin crew communication system. This wasn't protocol. But when the son of the CEO is falsely accused mid-air by a crew member and publicly humiliated despite verified documentation, exceptions are made, especially when the goal is justice, not theatrics. At 33,000 feet, the cabin intercom gave a single beep. Olivia, startled, looked down at the handset. It wasn't from the captain. It was coming from corporate operations. She answered softly. Her eyes widened. She turned to Charlotte. "You need to hear this." Charlotte rolled her eyes. "What now?" Olivia handed her the receiver, stepped back, and folded her arms. Charlotte pressed the handset to her ear. The voice on the other end was low, measured, and unmistakably powerful. It was James Reynolds himself. His words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. "This is James Reynolds. I understand you've questioned my son's right to sit in seat 3A. I also understand you've made unfounded accusations and attempted to fabricate a ticketing issue that does not exist." Charlotte froze her hand, visibly trembling. "Sir, she stammered. "You will stop speaking now," James continued. "From this moment forward, you are to return to the galley and refrain from any further engagement with my son. This flight will be met in Chicago by senior airline representatives. Olivia is now the acting lead attendant for this route. Do you understand me?" The cabin had gone silent, even though no one else could hear the call. But they could read her face. They could see the way her jaw twitched, the way her shoulders dropped, the way her illusion of control vanished in real time. "Yes, sir," she whispered. Olivia took the receiver, placed it gently back, and gave Charlotte a look that said everything words didn't have to. Then she turned to William, offering a quiet nod. He nodded back, acknowledging not victory, but relief. The truth had finally caught up. Lucas exhaled, sitting down again. "That boy handled it better than most grown men I know," he muttered to no one in particular. Henry added, "We witnessed something important today." Charlotte walked to the galley, no longer storming. She didn't speak. She didn't make eye contact. And for the first time since the flight began, she disappeared behind the curtain for good. William closed his eyes briefly. The storm hadn't ended, but the winds had shifted. What began as humiliation had turned into something else, a revelation. Not because of power, not because of revenge, but because of quiet strength, patient resistance, and a father who refused to stay silent when his son was being dehumanized at 3,000 feet. Just as the plane began its descent into Chicago, a new sound buzzed through the first-class cabin this time, not the usual overhead chime, but the sudden activation of the in-flight video monitors mounted above the bulkhead. One by one, they blinked on, casting a soft glow across the rows, and then a face appeared on screen, calm, serious, commanding. It was James Reynolds, president and CEO of Atlantic Skies Airlines, speaking live from the Executive Operations Suite at O'Hare. His image dressed in a navy suit and charcoal tie stared directly into the cabin, and his voice came through the speakers with the weight of a man who had seen too much to ever raise his tone. "Good afternoon, passengers and crew of Flight 417, he began. "What occurred aboard this aircraft today is not only unacceptable, it's un-American. My son William Reynolds is seated in 3A. He did not ask for special treatment. He did not demand anything. He showed up with his ticket, sat down quietly, and waited to fly. And what he received instead was humiliation." A stunned hush fell over the passengers, most of whom had now pieced together the connection between the calm young man in seat 3A and the powerful man speaking directly to them now. "Let me be clear." James continued, his voice like iron wrapped in velvet. "William earned that seat. Not because of who I am, but because of who he is. And I will not stand by while anyone, employee or otherwise, uses personal bias to strip dignity from another human being." In seat 3A, William remained seated, shoulders square, expression unreadable, but his hand slowly tightened around the leather folder in his lap. The weight of his father's voice didn't empower him, it grounded him. It reminded him that truth didn't always shout, but it always stood firm. In the galley, Charlotte stood stiff as a statue, one hand trembling near a drawer handle. Her face had gone pale, her authority stripped in the space of a few sentences. She had assumed William was just another teenage passenger trying to get away with something. But the truth was far more devastating. The young man she tried to belittle was the son of the man who could and now would hold her accountable. Olivia glanced toward William, her eyes filled with apology and admiration. Henry, seated across the aisle, nodded slowly. Lucas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, whispering to the passenger next to him, "Now that's a father, and that's a man who knows exactly what power is meant for." James continued on the screen, his tone never rising but his meaning razor sharp. "I've instructed our internal security team to review every second of footage from this flight, including body cam audio, intercom logs, and passenger statements. To the passengers who spoke up for my son, I thank you. To those who remained silent, I hope today gives you something to reflect on. And to the crew member who allowed her personal resentment to become public prejudice, you'll be met at the gate." As the message concluded, the screen faded to black. No further explanation, no drawn-out conclusion. Just the truth delivered plainly, and an entire cabin left staring into the space where the CEO had just spoken, not with fury, but with undeniable force. William looked ahead, not gloating, not even relieved, but resolute. He had stood his ground not with defiance, but with dignity. And now, the world knew. A few moments later, Charlotte stepped out from the galley for the first time since the video aired. Her shoulders were slumped now, her eyes avoiding everyone. She walked past William's row without a word, the weight of what was waiting for her at the gate pressing against her chest like an anchor. As she moved toward the back of the aircraft, passengers parted slightly to let her pass, most refusing to meet her eyes. She had spent the flight believing she had power. Now she carried the consequence of what she had done with it. Olivia walked the aisle with a kind of quiet grace, checking belts, adjusting trays. But when she reached William's seat, she paused. She crouched slightly, looked him in the eye, and said, "I'm sorry for not speaking up sooner. You handled it with more grace than I would have." William nodded gently. "Thank you for speaking at all," he said. "Most people wouldn't have." Her eyes welled slightly, but she smiled. "You're something special, kid." At the front of the plane, the captain gave the standard landing announcement, though this time his voice cracked slightly under the weight of the moment. "Flight crew, prepare the cabin for arrival." As the wheels lowered and the skyline of Chicago came into view, a feeling passed through the aircraft, not quite victory, but a release. The truth had been exposed. Accountability had been claimed. But more than anything, the moment had become larger than any single passenger, any single seat. It had become a mirror, one that showed people who they were in moments of silence and who they could be in moments of courage. And as the runway rushed beneath them and the plane finally touched down, William sat still in seat 3A, staring out the window, not at the city, but at the reflection, staring quietly back. The moment the aircraft doors opened at Gate C-19 in Chicago, the shift from tension to consequence was immediate. A small group of Atlantic Skies executives stood just beyond the jet bridge, led by a tall, clean-cut black man in his 50s, James Reynolds in person. No longer on screen, no longer a distant voice, but here now, with a presence that turned heads and silenced whispers. His navy suit was sharp, but it wasn't the fabric that commanded respect. It was his calm. He wasn't there to make a scene. He was there to restore balance. The first person off the aircraft wasn't William. It was Charlotte. Her posture was rigid, her mouth thin, her eyes locked forward. She barely glanced at the passengers she had served hours earlier. She knew what was coming. A uniformed HR director, flanked by two members of the flight operations team, stepped forward and quietly asked Charlotte to accompany them to a private area. No shouting, no drama, just 4 words. "You're being relieved now." She nodded stiffly and walked away. Her career had not ended because of one bad moment. It had unraveled because her choices, her judgments, and her refusal to listen had finally collided with the truth. William stepped off the plane next, holding his leather folder and walking with the kind of quiet that drew more attention than if he had spoken. He spotted his father immediately. James opened his arms, but instead of a dramatic embrace, he simply rested a hand on his son's shoulder and said, "You didn't flinch." William looked up and replied, "You taught me not to." Around them, passengers who had remained silent now watched with a mix of guilt and admiration. Some clapped softly, others lowered their heads. But a few Lucas, Henry, and Olivia stepped forward not to be seen, but because it was right. Lucas extended a hand. "I've taught thousands of students in my life, but I've never seen one sit through injustice with such poise." Henry followed. "You remind me of myself at your age, only braver." Olivia looked James in the eye. "Your son showed more leadership today than most people do in a lifetime." James shook her hand. "And you showed integrity when it mattered." What followed next wasn't flashy, but it was necessary. James addressed the remaining crew members and thanked them for de-escalating a situation that should never have occurred. He then announced that 2 replacement flight attendants, Taylor and Alex, would be joining the return crew immediately to allow Olivia and the captain time to debrief with corporate. Passengers began disembarking, and many took a moment to nod at William as they passed. A few paused to apologize, some for judging too quickly, others for not speaking at all. William accepted each gesture with grace, never once letting it go to his head. He didn't need validation. What he needed was fairness, and now, at least in this moment, he had it. As the gate area cleared, James and William walked a few steps away from the crowd. "I want to say something to them," William said. "The passengers." James raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to." But William shook his head. "I do. Not out of anger, out of purpose." 10 minutes later, as boarding began for the return flight to New York, the gate agent made a brief announcement. "One of our first-class passengers from Flight 417 would like to address the cabin for a moment before we depart. Please remain seated." William stepped forward, holding no notes, just standing at the front of the aisle with calm composure. Passengers turned, expecting something dramatic. But what they heard instead was something deeper. "My name is William Reynolds. I'm 16 years old. I'm a student from Brooklyn. I'm headed to the National Youth Leadership Conference because I believe in building bridges, not barriers. Earlier today, I was judged for how I look, not who I am. I wasn't loud. I wasn't disruptive. I just existed, and that was enough for someone to try to remove me." The cabin was silent. No phones, no coughs. Just attention. But I stayed in my seat. He continued, "Not because of who my father is, but because of what he taught me. That when people try to shrink you, you don't get smaller. You stand taller, even if you're sitting down." Several passengers looked away, tears forming quietly behind their eyes. Lucas and Henry listened like men who had waited decades for this kind of voice to be heard. "So to those of you who stood up, thank you," William said. "And to those who didn't, it's not too late to be different next time." Then he stepped back, nodded to the crew, and returned to his seat. He didn't look for applause, but it came anyway, not loud, but honest. And in that brief, unexpected moment, the aircraft became more than just a vessel in the sky. It became a space of reckoning, of reflection, and maybe, just maybe, of renewal. As the return flight ascended into the soft evening sky, the light outside dimmed to a warm golden glow, but inside the cabin of Flight 418, all eyes remained fixed on William. He sat in the same seat 3A, but this time the energy around him was different. There was no tension, no suspicion, no whispering. Just a quiet attentiveness, as if everyone on board had already begun re-evaluating not only the boy in that seat, but themselves. Taylor and Alex, the replacement flight attendants, moved respectfully through the cabin, offering refreshments and checking seatbelts, but it was clear they too sensed the unusual gravity in the air. Then, without being prompted, William pressed the overhead call button. Alex approached, unsure what he needed, but William simply asked, "Would it be all right if I said something to the passengers again? Just a few words." Alex hesitated only for a second, then nodded. "Of course. Take your time." Moments later, the intercom crackled softly as William's voice came over the speakers, clear, composed, and steady. "Good evening, everyone. I know today has been different," he began, "and I want to thank each of you for listening earlier. But before we land, I'd like to share something more personal, something I've never said out loud until now." The cabin fell into absolute silence. Even those half asleep in reclined seats lifted their heads. For a long time, I believed that if I just worked hard enough, if I kept my head down and got the grades volunteered, spoke respectfully, dressed clean, I could move through the world without having to prove myself over and over again. But the truth is, no matter how much I prepare, some people will still see me as a threat before they see me as a person. That realization hurt me more than I thought it would. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Today, I sat in a seat I earned. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I followed every rule. And still someone saw me as out of place. Not because of what I did, but because of what I look like. That's not just uncomfortable. That's injustice. A quiet shuffle echoed from a few rows as passengers adjusted, some leaning forward with tears quietly forming. But what I learned today, what I will carry with me forever, is that silence can be loud, and dignity can be defiant. I stayed in that seat not to win, but to remind myself, and maybe remind you, that being right doesn't mean being rude. That justice doesn't always come from shouting. It comes from standing still when others want you to disappear. His voice did not rise. He never spoke with bitterness. Instead, there was a gentleness, an emotional clarity that disarmed even the most guarded hearts. "I want to say thank you to Mr. Lucas. You spoke when it mattered. And Mr. Henry, thank you for showing me that quiet strength is the loudest of all. Ms. Olivia, you risked your position for the truth, and that's something I'll never forget. To the rest of you, whether you spoke or not, this moment gave all of us a choice. And the truth is, we'll all face a choice like this again. Maybe not on a plane, maybe not in public, but somewhere. When that moment comes, I hope you remember this one." There was no applause, no clapping yet. Just a silence so complete, it felt like the aircraft itself was listening. In 5D, Lucas wiped a tear from under his glasses. Henry stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, remembering his own past, a time when he too had been the boy who didn't belong. In 2A, an older white woman named Margaret, who had said nothing during the earlier incident, now whispered to her husband, "That boy just taught us more in 5 minutes than I learned in 50 years. Even Taylor and Alex stood still in the galley, listening, humbled. William continued, his voice now softer but just as firm. "I'm not perfect. I'm just trying to become the man my father raised me to be. And if I ever have a son, I pray he lives in a world where he won't have to send a text from his seat just to feel safe." That final sentence hit like a wave, simple, devastating, true. No dramatics, no blame, just the truth. When he finished, he didn't wait for applause. He set the handset down and returned to his seat. Only then, slowly and without instruction, the cabin erupted not in wild cheering, but in the kind of applause that comes from being changed. Passengers clapped through their tears. Others bowed their heads. Some simply sat in silence, hearts thudding with emotion too deep for words. And in that space, 30,000 feet above the ground, William had done something extraordinary. He didn't just reclaim his dignity. He reminded everyone what it looked like to carry it even when it's under attack. He had turned a humiliating confrontation into a moment of healing. And as the plane continued its journey through the quiet clouds, no one doubted it. They had just witnessed something rare, something real. A message they would carry long after their flight had landed. When the plane touched down at JFK just past sunset, the passengers aboard Flight 418 disembarked not with the usual shuffle of carry-ons and murmured complaints, but with something heavier on their hearts, and something brighter too. What had begun as an ordinary flight had transformed mid-air into a quiet reckoning and a powerful reminder of how easy it is to judge and how necessary it is to pause, to listen, to truly see. William was one of the last to leave the cabin, not because he lingered for attention, but because several passengers, one after the next, had waited just to speak with him. A retired nurse touched his shoulder and whispered, "You reminded me of my grandson. He's just like you, quiet kind, always overlooked. Thank you for standing up." A businessman from row 6 offered his card and said, "If you ever need a mentor in finance, call me. We need minds like yours in the room." Even a teenage girl approached, eyes wide and voice soft, saying, "You made me want to be brave." William accepted each word with humility, not as praise but as responsibility. He never smiled out of pride, only gratitude. And when he stepped off the plane and into the terminal, his father James was waiting, arms crossed, a subtle smile on his face that held both pride and restraint. "You okay?" he asked, not as a CEO, not as a man whose video had gone viral overnight, but simply as a dad. William nodded. "I am now." James placed a hand on his back. "They're already talking about this at corporate," he said quietly. "Passengers are calling, journalists, even a few employees from other flights. Your words, they're moving people." William looked out across the terminal. Then maybe that's worth more than the seat ever was. Over the next 24 hours, a video clip of William's speech captured by a passenger on her phone circulated across social media. Not in the usual sensational way, but with quiet reverence. No music, no filters, just his voice. The caption read, "16-year-old quietly redefines what courage looks like at 3,000 feet." Within hours, the clip reached over 10 million views. By morning, national news outlets were requesting interviews, educators were sharing his words in classrooms, and letters began pouring in, digital and handwritten, from across the country. Some came from teenagers who had experienced the same kind of bias, but never had the words to explain it. Others came from older Americans, black, white, and everything in between, who admitted they had once thought like Charlotte and were now reconsidering what fairness truly meant. Charlotte herself was no longer employed by Atlantic Skies. After a full internal review, her employment was terminated not out of vengeance, but out of accountability. She declined all media interviews, but a handwritten note was delivered privately to James Reynolds' office days later. Inside it read, "I let my pain become prejudice. I saw your son as a symbol of what I'd lost, not who he is. I'm sorry. Truly." James read it quietly, then passed it to William without a word. William didn't say anything either. He just folded the note and placed it inside the back of his leather folder, not as forgiveness, not as closure, but as a reminder. A week later, William stood at the podium of the National Youth Leadership Conference in Chicago. He wasn't scheduled to speak, but the event organizers had changed the program after watching what unfolded in the sky. He was introduced not as the son of a CEO, but as a young man who reminded America what character looks like when no one expects it. He stood on stage in a navy blazer and a crisp white shirt, his shoes polished but his voice still soft and sincere. A seat, he said, is just a seat until someone tries to take it away. Then it becomes a line in the sand, not between first class and economy, but between judgment and justice. The audience, filled with young leaders, mentors, educators, and policymakers, listened like it mattered because it did. I didn't ask for what happened, but I'm not sorry it did. Because maybe for the first time people saw what happens when we stand still with truth in our hearts, even when the world tells us to move. That night after the conference, James and William walked together along the riverfront, the lights of the city dancing on the water. They didn't speak much. They didn't have to. What had been broken had been answered with strength. What had been meant to humiliate had turned into a platform for grace. And in that quiet moment, William turned to his father and asked, "Do you think it'll make a difference?" "Really?" James looked out at the skyline, then back at his son. "I think he said you gave people a mirror. What they do with it, that's on them. But you showed them who you are, and who we all could be." William nodded, the night breeze brushing past him like a closing curtain. This wasn't just the end of a flight. It was the beginning of something else. Not a movement, not a trend, but a seed. A small, powerful seed of change planted quietly in the heart of everyone who heard him speak. And maybe that would be enough to grow something better. Thank you for watching. If this story meant something to you, please like, subscribe, and share. Take care and see you in the next one.